Shalom Aleichem. Today is Yom Hamishi B'Shabbat, Beth Ba'adar, the second day of the month of Adar, which is the 12th month of the year, Talshin Pewal, corresponding to the 19th of February 2026, the minyan over there, Hathaluv. And we continue in Perek Rishon of Hilchot Tefillah, first chapter of Hilchot Tefillah, Rabbeinu HaGadol, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimun, Zichrono Livracha, and we are in Halacha Waw, or Halacha Het, and we have to discuss briefly something that we didn't really discuss last time. Rambam here says, speaking about Tefillat Arvit, he says, "V'chen hitkinu sheyeh adam mitpalel tefillah ahath balayla." So there is a tefillah, a Shemoneh Esrei, which we recite in the evening or at night. And having explained before, this has to do with all the tefillot are in some way correspond to a korban. Sharei evorei tamid shel ben ha'arbaim mitakelim u'halachim kol halayla. As we mentioned last time. And then Rambam goes on to say, وَأَن تَفِلَاتْ عَرْوِيت حُوَى كِتْفِلَاتْ شَحَرِيتُ مِنْهَا. It is not min hadin. Essentially, it is not on the same level of obligation. One is not obligated in the same way to daven arvit as one is to daven shaharit or minha. And nevertheless, Naharu Kol Yisrael, it is the practice of all of Am Yisrael. B'chol mekomot moshevotehem. In other words, this is not a localized minhag. It's Kol Yisrael b'chol mekom, and therefore it is a particularly powerful minhag, shall we say? And it's akin to a halacha. Rithpalel arvit v'kibbelu aleihem ketfilat chova. It is the accepted practice by all Jews everywhere to daven arvit, like any other tefillah, al-shaharit or minha, and they accepted it upon themselves as a chova. So Rambam says, this is more or less a rewording of what the Rif writes, and earlier in Geonim. And here we have to state as follows. This statement is in line with what we understand from the Sugiyot in the Talmud Bavli. In the Talmud Bavli, it seems quite clear that this was in fact the understanding, that Arvit is Rashut and not Hova. But we have to explain a little bit, we have to delve into the term Rashut a little bit more. The statement that Arvit is Rashut is explicitly stated in Chazal, in the Talmud, in Masechet Barachot, and other places, Masechet Yomah. There is also a discussion. It's not agreed to by all that Arvit is Rashut. Rabban Gamliel says that Arvit is Hova. Rabbi Yoshua says it is Rashut. And the halacha is like Rabbi Yoshua. This was the view of a majority of the Hachamim and of those who came after them. So the halacha is that Arvit is Rashut. And we find this to be the case also in the Talmud Yerushalmi. There is, however, a difference that we need to mention here between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, between the two Talmudim. According to the Bavli, and this is what Rambam presents us with here, Rashut means exactly what you might assume it means. Rashut, it is entirely up to you, because the word Rashut means literally you have permission to do so, but it's not a chovah. You're not required to do so. It's not an obligation. And this is how the Talmud Bavli, based on more than one sugya, we see that this is how they understood the term. And therefore, if you turn around and you see that everyone's davening Arvit, then you need to explain why, because you would think you should find at least a few people who choose not to, if it's a Rashut. But the fact is, everyone is davening Arvit, as the Rambam states here, as the Rif states, for example, also. And therefore, the statement that we find in some of the Geonim, and then more clearly and explicitly in the Rif and in the Rambam here, is that Am Yisrael took upon themselves. How exactly such a process of taking upon themselves grows up is not explained here, and it's not entirely clear. But it became the common practice that everyone davens Arvit like any other Tefillah. But essentially it's Rashut. And this, for example, explains why, as Rambam will write elsewhere, why there is no Hazrat Hashatz of Arvit. As Rambam writes elsewhere, because no one was Hayav Be'etzem Milechat Tefillah to daven Arvit. So you don't have to have especially if you relate to Hazrat Hashatz as existing primarily, at least, in order to be Muthiya their Hova, those who are unable to daven by themselves, then seeing that this is a Rashut, it wasn't part of the accepted practice that Am Yisrael adopted, that there should also be a Hazrat Hashatz. That's how we would understand it. However, in the Talmud Yerushalmi we see clearly, particularly from more than one place, both in Masechet Berachot and also in Masechet Ta'aniyot, we see that the meaning of the word Rashut, and this is also true in other contexts, the meaning of the word Rashut does not always mean it's entirely up to you, and you can either do it or not do it. Sometimes the word Rashut means it is something you should do, but the level of obligation is of a lower order. So if you ask, the Chacham, should I daven Arvit? The answer will be, according to that, yes, you should daven Arvit, definitely. Am I required to? Yes. But in certain extenuating circumstances, it is possible to be more lenient and tell a person that in this particular situation, you're not required to daven Arvit. And we find this explicitly, for example, in the one such example is if a person already undressed and is in bed and is about to fall asleep, and then he realizes, I did not daven Arvit. And by the way, this has nothing to do with Kriyat Shema. We should explain. These are two separate mitzvot, as we've mentioned many times. So the assumption is here that he did recite Kriyat Shema with the brachot, but he didn't recite Arvit. And then he remembered when he's in bed already and dropping off to sleep that he didn't recite Tefillat Arvit. He does not have to get up and dress and daven right now, which is not something we would say with regards to Shaharit or Minha. Based on that statement in the Talmud and some other facts, the Tosafot explain, and this is a very powerful and illuminating example of the profundity of the Baalei Tosafot, that they perceived very correctly, although they did not, the Tosafot, as I recall, did not specifically mention the Yerushalmi as there is a Surya that from which this can be demonstrated in the Yerushalmi, and they don't bring that as a proof. They bring other proofs, but they very correctly, with great insight, understood that the word Rashut, the term Rashut, does not always mean simply it's up to you and do as you please. It means that it's a chova of a lower order. We see this in a number of situations with regards to other halachot as well, and that is the case here. And I believe that is the correct interpretation of the term Rashut as was used by the Chachamim with regards to, as it was used with regards to Arvit. And one ramification of this is that, as is stated in the Talmud Bavli Masechet Yoma, if you understand that, if, for example, assuming that you daven Ne'ilah not during the day but already in the evening after the sun sets, which is the beginning of Zman Arvit, in actual fact, not connected again to Zman Kriyat Shema, which is Tzitha Kochavim, when 3 stars appear, which is well after sunset. If you were to daven Ne'ilah after the sun sets, which is apparently what, according to some views in Chazal, that is when Ne'ilah should be recited, not as is usually understood today, not as the Rambam himself will tell us in the next halakha. Then, according to the Talmud Bavli, he who says that Arvit is Rashut, you do not have to daven Arvit separately, because you already davened a Tefillah at that time of day, in the evening. Whereas if you understand that Arvit is Chovah, then you are required to daven Arvit, even though you just davened Ne'ilah during that same time frame of the evening, because Arvit is Chovah, Ne'ilah cannot be poter Arvit. The fact that you daven Ne'ilah doesn't mean that you're exempt from Arvit. If you say it is Rashut, so states the Talmud Bavli explicitly, then you should understand that you are not required to daven both Ne'ilah and Arvit if they are both in the time slot of the evening, shall we say. In other words, the period that Rambam says here, Mitpalel Tefillah Hath Balayla. And yet we see, by the way, that all of Am Yisrael, as we all know, daven Motzei Yom Kippurim, both Ne'ilah and Arvit. The reason for that could be twofold. It could be because it is common practice nowadays to daven Ne'ilah before the sun sets, in which case it doesn't really, there's no reason why that should exempt you from Arvit. And it could be that in earlier times, when it was perhaps more common to daven Arvit, to daven Ne'ilah, after the sun sets, then it will, the fact that we see Am Yisrael davening 2 tefillot, Motzei Yom Kippurim, may have to do with the fact that, as I'm saying, that Rashut does not actually mean that you don't have to daven, and therefore it doesn't exempt one from another tefillah. So I think that the interpretation, the perush of the Tosafot, B'Shem Rabbeinu Yitzchak HaZaken Ba'al Tosafot and others, which is, I think, clearly demonstrated in the Yerushalmi, is actually the more precise and correct understanding of the topic. One of the things that follows from this is that, according to that, there should be a Hazrat Hashatz in the evening for Arvit as for any other tefillah. And this is exactly what we do find in the Talmud Yerushalmi. It speaks about people hearing what the Shliach Tzibur says in the evening, and knowing if he recites Mashiv Ruach Morit HaGeshem, shall we say, in the evening on Shmini Aseret, then people will know from that tefillah, from that Hazrat Hashatz, they will know that from this point on, we are to recite Mashiv Ruach Morit HaGeshem. That statement cannot possibly be understood if you assume that there is no Hazrat Hashatz in the evening. That is Mefurash in the Yerushalmi. This is something that I don't think I've seen anyone really pick up on, but it's Mefurash. It's clear.
What was the historical reality in Jewish communities across the world in the very early period of the Gaonim, right after the Talmud?
I'm not sure that I can answer that question. Do you mean to ask, was it the historical reality, you say the early period of the Gaonim, so I don't know what period, let's say the year 700 Leminyonam. Is that what you mean? Something like that, or 750 or 800, I don't know. If you're asking if in most Jewish communities or in various Jewish communities was Tefillat Arvit done by all or not done by all, recited by all or not? Apparently not, because we have Teshuvot from the Geonim, in which it states explicitly the following. The reason that Kaddish, or what's called Chatzi Kaddish, is recited after Birkot Kriyat Shema in the evening, according to a statement of certain Geonim quoted by certain Rishonim, and it's more than one teshuvah, is quite explicit. The reason that Kaddish is recited by the Shliach Tzibur at the end of Birkot Kriyat Shema in the evening, shall we say after Ashkivenu, or in Chutz La'aretz after, whatever else is added after Ashkivenu, doesn't matter right now. The reason for that is rather than doing what? Rather than being Somech Gula Shel Arvit, Tefillah Shel Arvit, which is what Rabbi Yochanan states explicitly in the Talmud, the Masechet Berachot Daf Daled. So why are we being mafsik? Lichora, that's a hefsek, a very clear hefsek. So the Geonim say the opposite. They say, yes, it's a hefsek, and the reason for this hefsek is dafka. We're reciting Kaddish now in order to announce that Tfilat Arvit is Rashut, and those who wish to leave may leave. In other words, you're in Beit Knesset. You came to the Beit Knesset. Let's say at the end of the day, maybe you davened Arvit, and maybe you stayed for a while. Maybe there was a shiur in the Mishneh Berurah or whatever it is, or in Hilchot the Rabbi Gaon at that time perhaps, or whatever. And now Kriyat Shema has been recited by all, and now the Shliach, and everyone stands up, and you can do one of two things. You can hear Kaddish and you can leave because you don't wish to take upon yourself the practice of reciting Arvit now, or you can remain for Arvit. So the fact that we find this teshuvah, the statement made by more than one Gaon, quoted in a number of sources, that this is why Kaddish is recited at this time, in order to announce that Tfilat Arvit is Rashut, and those who wish to leave may do so. This demonstrates clearly that in many communities, apparently in Bavel, is not in all of the Jewish world, but certainly in Bavel and surrounding areas, it was not at that point, in the, shall we say, early to midpoint of the Geonim, the Gonic period, it was not a universal practice in Daven Arvit. So that's what we know for a fact. I'm guessing, not that I know for a fact, I cannot prove it because I don't have a parallel teshuvah from a Gaon in Eretz Yisrael at that time. But it's quite possible, I would think even likely, that in Eretz Yisrael at that same time, Arvit was being recited by all. That is what I think. And in fact, what I think happened here is, as with certain other practices, the minhag or the psak of Eretz Yisrael eventually became accepted in Bavel as well. It wasn't originally the practice, it wasn't the original Bavli position, but eventually became accepted in Bavel as well. And we see this on a number, with regards to a number of other halachot, as I think we've mentioned, for example, where the Kriyat Shema is min Torah or midivrei soferim. The original position of the Talmud Bavli was, as it appears in certain nuschaot, that Kriyat Shema is midrabanan, and it has a special status because of Kabbalat Malchut Shamayim, but not because it's min Torah. And therefore it has a certain status, or a certain things apply to it that do not apply to Tefillah, to Shmoneh Esrei. Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, the general position was that Kriyat Shema is min Torah. And this opinion eventually became the accepted view in Bavel as well. But that was a development. That was and you see this. The Rif has to go out of his way to stress that Kriyat Shema is min Torah. And even though Shmuel says explicitly Kriyat Shema d'Rabbanan, in other words, Shmuel says Kara Kriyat Shema lo Safek Kara Kriyat Shema Safek lo Kara eno Hozer eno Kore. And how can that be? So the Rif goes out of his way to tell you, no, the halacha is not like Shmuel. But the truth is, originally in Bavel, halacha was like Shmuel. And this becomes apparent if you investigate all the various nuschaot of the sugyot. And that's why you find many various nuschaot within those sugyot, where it seems to be there's confusion and there's no uniformity in the statements in the Talmud for this very reason. That's why you find in the Hilchot the Rabbi Gaon the Kriyat Shema is befashtut mashma, from what is quoted there. Kriyat Shema is not min Torah. All right, so that's the best answer I can give you with regards to that. Rambam continues, Halacha Tayet Ozayin, V'chen tiknu tefillah ahal tefilat hamincha, samuch l'shkiat ha'chama, in other words, samuch just before, b'yom ha'ta'anif bilvad. So says Rambam. This is, of course, what's called ne'ilah. K'dei lo hosif tehina v'akasha mipnei ha'ta'anif. So this is a special tefillah b'yomei ta'anif. V'zo ha'tefillah nikret tefilat ne'ilah. כלומר, ננעלו שערי השמיים בעד השמש ונסתרה, לפי שהם מתפללים אותה אלא סמוך לשקיעת החמה. So, from Rambam here it is clear that it has to be done during the day when the sun is still visible, before the sun sets. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, we see there is a discussion regarding this in Masechet Berachot, and it's clear that at least according to some views there, Ne'ilah was davened after the sunset. This may have to do with the discussion of Ben Hashemashot, when the day ends, when the night begins, if there's a period in between called Ben Hashemashot, and if so, for how long does it last? It may have to do with that, it may not have to do with that. Not entirely clear, at least not to me. But that's the fact. As I mentioned, in the Surya, which appears in the Bavli, in Yoma, with regards to Arvit and Ne'ilah, it's clear that they are assuming that Ne'ilah is davened after the sun sets. And that's why it might possibly exempt one from davening Arvit as well. If that's not the case, it's difficult to understand why would be such a possibility would be considered. So Rambam continues and tells us now, Halacha Het Yod Nimsa'u Tefillot B'chol Yom Shalosh. So every day, on the average day, there are 3 tefillot, Arvit, V'Shaharit, U'Minha. U'V'Shabbatot, U'Mu'adim, V'Rashi Chodashim, Arba'. There is a 4th tefillah, which is the Musaf, Shalosh Shel Kol Yom, U'Tfilat HaMusafim, because there's an extra Korban Musaf on that day. U'Yom HaKippurim, Hamesh, because of the Ne'ilah, Arba' Elo, U'Tfilat Ne'ilah. Okay. Rambam continues, Halacha Yod Aleph, Uteth, Tefillot Elu, and Pohathin Mehen. In other words, these tefillot are chova. You cannot decide to daven once or twice. These 3 tefillot daily, and 4 on Shabbat and Yom Tov v'chulei, and 5 on Yom Kippurim, shall we say, these are chova. Aval, Mosifim Alehem, you're allowed to add. In other words, there is a concept of tefillat nedava, that a person can feel that he wishes to daven more, an extra time, or extra 2 times even. Even if a person wishes to daven literally all day long, harashut biyado. This is an expression, it doesn't mean all day long, but it means that you're not limited. You can recite tefillah multiple times during the day. Harashut biyado, v'chol otana tefillot sheyosif, kamo makriv nedavot. Just as a person can bring a korban nedava, a korban which he is not obligated to bring to the mikdash, so a person is able to daven a tefillat nedava. Therefore, lefichach, tzarich sheyahadesh davar b'tefillah b'chol beracha u'beracha min ha'imtza'iyot ma'ana beracha. In other words, lechatchila, what you must do if you choose to daven a tefillat nedava, you should be mehadesh davar, which means to add some extra tehina, bakasha, some whatever feelings and ideas and requests well up in the heart of a person. In the berachot ha'imsa'iyot, in other words, the 12 middle berachot, a person should add something, me'an ha'beracha, something related to that beracha. So again, לפיכך צריך שיחדש דבר בתפילה בכל ברכה וברכה מן האמצעיות מן הברכה. That's לכתחילה the requirement in order to go ahead and daven a tefillat nedava. And this is also, I think, why in the Galuth, a tefillat nedava became less and less something realistic, because fewer and fewer people were able to express themselves b'lashon hakodesh, as we discussed last time, in a satisfactory manner, so that they could really be musif. Because we're not talking about something that you read out of a siddur. This is something that you, so to speak, ad lib, and therefore you have to be what we learned before in the earlier halachot, what we learned over here in halacha gimel. Im haya ragil mabeh b'tchila u'bakasha. See, this is exactly what I'm saying. If you are ragil, you know how to express yourself. You're familiar with the lashon of the Tanakh, of lashon hakodesh, and therefore you're able to fluently express your feelings and ideas and emotions and requests in an appropriate manner, as marbeh b'tchila u'bakasha, that follows. But if you're not in that situation, if lashon hakodesh is almost not understood by you, or your command of lashon hakodesh is very limited, not to say non-existent, then if that's the case, then how are you going to daven nedava? So it follows that tefillat nedava will cease to be something that exists for most Jews. So I think, as with many other things, as I think we've mentioned on more than one occasion, the galuth and all that flows from the galuth, such as an increasing ignorance of Lashon HaKodesh, an increasing lack of familiarity and fluency in Lashon HaKodesh, results in various transformations and various realities coming into existence. And one of them, I think, is what we see here, that you cannot daven a tefillat nedava if you do not have a truly significant and proficient command of Lashon HaKodesh. So Rambam said here that you have to mehadesh b'chol beracha or beracha mina misayot me'ena beracha. In each beracha, something related to that beracha, which also proves, this statement here also proves that it is lechatchila mutar to add and to ad lib within the nusach of the tefillah, according to within the framework of the halacha. So within the framework of this halacha, within each beracha, based on the theme of each beracha, you are to, in the case of an nedava, you are required to ad lib, to add whatever it is that you feel that you wish to add. So there is the basic skeletal nusach that you know, that all Jews know, hopefully. But if you wish to add more, then you can add. No, there's no reason to think that's not the case. In fact, it's clearly is the case that you are allowed to do so, and you're even encouraged. In this case, you are obligated to do so. And even though you were able or motivated to only add some of your own words and inject them into one of the brachot of the Emsayot, that's also sufficient. Dayo, that's okay. That's that is the minimal requirement. So lechatchila you mehadesh every bracha of the Emsayot, and it's sufficient. But the avad, one bracha is also sufficient. Rambam here now adds another statement. Ushalosh rishonoth, ushalosh aharonoth, the first three and the last three barachot. So we're talking about Mochen Avraham, Hayam Yothim, and Ha'el HaKadosh, and then from Birkat Avodah, from Ratzeh and Muzi, and then Hodaya, and then Birkat Shalom, the last three barachot. With regards to these six barachot, Le'olam en mosifim bahen, v'lo pohatim mehen, v'en meshanim bahem davar. So says Rambam here. And Lichora, that's very straightforward. The last three brachot have a special status, which is different from the other brachot. They are fixed, they are immutable, they are not to be added to, not detracted from, and they cannot be tampered with. If you switch for a moment to Perek Sheni, the end of Perek Sheni, which I will show you here now, in this second Perek of Hilchot Tefillah, Rambam discusses mainly the various additions and special things that need to be said or added to the Tefillah on certain days of the year, certain times of the year. And Rambam writes here at the very end, Perek Beth Halacha Yotet or Halacha Kaf Aleph, as you should be able to see. Yesh Mekomot, says Rambam, Shenaru Ma'aseret Yomim Elu. In other words, Aseret Yomei Teshuvah. In other words, Rosh Hashanah till Yom Kippur, inclusive. Lohosif Bivracha Rishona Zurchenu Lehayim. The first bracha, there's this extra snippet, as we know, appears in basically all Sidurim. Most Sidurim, Zochrenu Lehayim. That's in Machon Avraham. And in the second bracha, Michamocha Avarahamim, or Avarahaman, as Rambam's Nusach here is. Umusifim Bivikat Shmone Esrei, Zachor Rahamecha, Uchavosh Ka'ascha, etc. In other words, this is a bracha which is added in Bikat Mudim, in Bikat Hodaya, and Musifim Bivracha Ahrona V'Sefer Hayim, before the end of the last bracha. Rambam, of course, is mentioning this here on the heels of what he mentioned in the previous halacha. The previous halacha Yod Het or Kaf, Rambam says, Kol Hashana Kula Hotem Bivracha Shelishith Ha'el HaKadosh Uvracha Achat Esrei Melech Ohev Tzedakah U'Mishpat. However, Uvaseret Hayamim Shemirosh Hashanah Ad Motzei Yom Kippurim Hotem B'Shelishith HaMelech HaKadosh Uvachat Esrei HaMelech HaMishpat. So that statement appears explicitly in the Talmud, in Masechet Barachot, in the Bavli, not in the Yerushalmi. This is something which the Bavli states and became a halacha pesuka in Bavel. It's mentioned the name of Rav, but it does not appear in any source for Eretz Yisrael. And it's quite clear that in Eretz Yisrael this was not the case. But this is, according to Bavli, this is the halacha with regards to those two brachot, Ha'el HaKadosh, which becomes HaMelech HaKadosh, and Melech Ohev Tzedakah U'Mishpat, which becomes HaMelech HaMishpat. But then Rambam added, as we just read, that there are also other additions which are not mentioned in the Talmud. In the first bracha, Zochen L'Hayim, the second bracha, Michamocha, Avarahamim, Avarahaman, etc. In the last two brachot also. And Lichora, this statement here, the end of Perek Sheni, contradicts the statement at the end of Perek Rishon, because we just read at the end of the second to last halacha in Perek Rishon, Rambam just told us, V'shalosh Rishonot, V'shalosh Aharonot, Le'olam, En Mosifim Bahem, V'lo Pochatim Bahem, V'en Meshanim Bahem Davar. So how can such additions be recited? And before anyone suggests that I am being somewhat nitpicking or being fanatical about the meaning of this halacha, it should be pointed out that in the halachot gedolot it states explicitly, which is centuries before Rambam, deep in the time of the Geonim, it states there explicitly. It expresses the opinion, which is perhaps not accepted or expressed universally by all the Geonim, but certainly by some of the Geonim, that these additions, such as Zochen L'Hayim in Moren Avraham, are not to be recited, but precisely because of this halacha, that one does not add or do anything, change in any way the first three and the last three brachot. So there is room for this question that I'm asking. I have seen that some refer to a teshuvah of Rambam, which appears in the second volume of Teshuvot HaRambam, Helek Beth Siman Chof Pe Daled, which here before me is on page 336. And here the question that Rambam is asked is as follows, I quote, ויורנו בדבר מה שהזכיר הדרתו בפרק 60 מהלכות תפילה, אבל לא ישאל לא בשלוש ראשונות ולא בשלוש האחרונות. In other words, Rambam mentions this as well, also in Perek Shishi. Here Rambam says, also this relates to what we just learned. Rambam says here, המתפלל עם הציבור, this is הלכה ב' in Perek Shishi of Hilchot Tefillah, לא יאריך בתפילתו יותר מדי. When you are davening the tzibur with a minyan, because there is Chazat Hashatz to come, you should not daven particularly slowly, and thus you will miss the Tfilat Shliach HaTzibur. That is the reason when Rambam says here. This is based on what it says in the Tosefta by Rabbi Akiva. But if when you're davening alone, we do Yom Kippurim, Omer, you're allowed to get carried away as much as you like, as it were. As it says there again with regards to Rabbi Akiva, there is Mishtahaweh and it is Ma'arich, etc. So one can turn one's tefillah in that setting, when one is alone, into a, if you want to use the term, a kind of a Breslov experience. In other words, you can be, there is room for the Shmoneh Esrei to become a very personalized and very powerful, moving, and free-form experience. So you see this, Mefurash. This is possible. But not when you're a B'tzibur. The main reason is because you will miss the Tfilat HaTzibur, which is a very important thing, if understood correctly. Rambam says here further, وَخَنْ إِمْ رَثَى لَهُسِيف بِخَلْ بَرَخَ وَبَرَخَ مِنْهَا إِنْسَعِيوث. With regards to the middle barachot, you want to add anything at all that is relevant to that particular baracha, me'ena baracha, musif, you're allowed to do so. This is exactly what we read previously in Perek Aleph about adding when one davens a tefillat nedavar. But then Rambam goes on to say, and then he explains, he gives an example. Kesad hayalo hole, if there's a person in his family, for example, or a person that he knows who's very ill, mevakesh alo rahamim b'virkat holim. What you may do, and is even recommended that a person does so, and here it says explicitly what I said before, kafi sahut lashono. You have to have lashon sahah in order to be able to do this. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do this. So again, this halacha in the Galuth, as Jews became less and less familiar with Lashon HaKodesh, ceased to be a reality. So many things that we see that Chazal had in mind and recommended and were used to and taught their Talmidim to do, in the Galut we see that many of these things, because of the realities of the Galut and the negative impact of the Galut on the Jewish people, ceased to be a viable proposition. So Rambam says, if you have a person that you wish to daven for, mevakesh alo rahamim v'virkat holim, kafi tzahuf l'shono, fine, that makes sense. Haya tzarich lefarnasa, a person, either for himself or others, wishes to daven for inyanim shel parnasa, livelihood, musif tehina ubakasha b'virkat hashani, which is the relevant bracha. Wa'al derech zo b'chol ahat mehem. There's also another possibility, says Rambam. You can ask for anything at all you like, for yourself, for others, in the bracha shomea tefillah, which is a catch-all, so to speak, bracha, because it's a general bracha of shmi'at tefillah, of tehina, and therefore you can say add anything you like within that bracha, insert it, and then end with the usual ending of the bracha. Aval, Rambam says, lo yisha'al lo b'shalosh rishanot v'lo b'shalosh aharonot. Bakashov should not be mentioned and not to be said in the first three and the last three barachot. So this is what the person asking the question here in Rambam's Teshuvah, Kof Pe Dalet, was familiar with. He says, Avalis, you wrote, Rambam, Rabbeinu, you wrote in Hilchot Tefillah Perek Shishi, Lo Yishal, Lo B'Shosh Rishonot, Lo B'Shosh Achronot. However, he says, V'naharu sheyahid Yosif kitfilat Rashut ba'avodah ma'amar b'zeh lashon. In other words, there is a minhag, there is a nusa that some people have adopted in Birkat Avodah, which is one of the last three. Bahar Marom Yisrael, Sham na'avodcha, v'sham nidrosh et kol asher tzivitanu, b'reach nihoach teraseh othanu, tehazenu inenu. Okay, so this is an addition that was added into the nusach of Birkat Tzeh. Haim ze mutar. Is this mutar or not mutar? Because this is a bakasha, lichora, that's being added into this one of these last barachot. Rambam's lashon in Rambam's teshuvah is as follows. He says, this is in the teshuvah which appears in this edition before me, which is Hosa'at Mekiseh Nirdomim, page 339. Zohar lashon, this that you mentioned, shemosifim ba'avodah, ena mezika. It's not a problem. Wa'en bara, there's nothing at all reprehensible about it. Wa'en zeh shoel tharacho, and this is not considered shoel tharacho. Ela zeh inyana baracha. Why? Because this is exactly the inyan of the baracha. In other words, all you're doing is expanding the lashon of the baracha of Birkat Avodah, which b'zman galut, when there is no mikdash and no korbanot, the baracha is not about risuya korbanot, but about asking for hashavat ha'avodah, right? And that's exactly what you're doing. You're saying, Baham Marom Yisrael, Sham na'avodcha, v'sham nidrosh, etc. So it's exactly on topic. It's exactly the theme of the baracha. And therefore it's not extraneous. And it's not considered bakashat srachim of anywhere. That's the nusach of the baracha. That is the idea of the baracha, the purpose of this baracha. And you're just adding a few words. That's okay, because it's entirely within the parameters of this baracha. However, I don't think you can say the same about these tosafot that Rambam mentioned in Hilchot at the end of Perek Rishon. In other words, the adding Zochora, what Rambam, mentioned that you do not do in Perek Rishon, and what he mentions explicitly, on the other hand, in Perek Sheni, that you do. Rambam said over here, as we saw, that yesh mekomot, he doesn't say it's universal, he doesn't say it's a chovah, but he says yesh mekomot shena'aku b'aseret yomim elu losif b'bracha rishona zochenu l'chaim, etc. Now, zochenu l'chaim, melech hafes b'chaim, etc., kodven b'sefer ha'chaim, all such ideas, michamocha avarachamim, zoche yusura l'chaim b'rachamim, all such additions, as beautiful and beautifully expressed as they may be, they are entirely not part of the nusach, not on topic at all. They're off theme completely. What has that got to do with the tochen, the meaning, and the words of the bracha Mochen Avraham? Absolutely nothing. It does use the words in the bracha, the words that appear in the nusach habavli, zocher hasdeh ovoth, and then it goes immediately zochrenu l'chaim. So the zochrenu is a runoff, or somehow attaches itself, or there is an attempt to attach it to the words zocher hasdeh ovoth, but it has nothing to do with the bracha Mochen Avraham. In the same way, with regards to Mahaya Metim, you could argue that it is more closely related to the theme of the bracha, but the truth is I don't really accept that either, that argument, because Mahaya Metim, the bracha Mahaya Metim, is not talking about this world, Olam Hazeh, it's talking about Olam Haba, Tahiyat HaMetim. So even if you do ask for Milchamocha Av HaRahamim, Zochei Yisrael Hayim B'Rahamim, the din of Rosh Hashanah and Aseret Yemei Teshuvah has to do with Olam Hazeh, not Olam Haba. As the Ramban and the Tosafot discuss in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, and the Ramban in Torah Adam. So the Ramban has the Sha'ar HaGemul and discusses that what the Gemara discusses about the din of Rosh Hashanah and whether it refers to Olam Hazeh or not, Olam Haba. So the din of Rosh Hashanah has to do with Olam Hazeh. Has to, as we say, Mufurash in the Tefillah, and as appears also in some of the Piyutim, like Unathanat Tokef, right? Mi Yehia, Mi Yamuth, Mi Bechiso, Mi Lo Bechiso, Ba'esh, B'mayim, etc., etc. So clearly, it is talking about Olam Hazeh, not about Tahiyat HaMethim, which is a different topic, a different set of ideas, and a different reality altogether. So these Tosafot also, B'Sefer Hayim B'Racha V'Shalom, Kodveno B'Sefer Hayim, all these statements do not really have anything to do with the essential bracha, with the essential themes of these brachot. That is one reason why I did not recite these Tosafot. It's clear that they're not a chova, as Rambam himself makes clear. This is the Lashon of Rambam here. It does not imply from Rambam that it's a chova to add any of these things. He does say the yesh mekomot shenaru. That's definitely true. And at the end of this halacha, at the end of this perek, in other words, perek Sheni, Rambam says the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim minhag pashut is commonly accepted practice. Losif b'shlishit u'v'chen ten pachtecha. And u'v'chen ten pachtecha is a beautiful and very ancient tosefet to Birkath Kiddush Hashem. But I don't think it can be compared to the additions which are added, like Zocher L'Chaim to Morin in the Birkath Morin Avraham, or the brachot that are added, the Michamocha V'Rahamim in Mechayim Yefim, or Zchor Hamecha in Birkath Hodaya. Why not? Because Kedushat Hashem, Birkat Kedushat Hashem, has to do with Kiddush Hashem Ba'olam, and that is exactly the theme of Uv'chen ten pachtecha, Uv'chen yitkadesh shimcha, etc., as appears in some of the Nuschaot. In other words, the entire thrust of this beautiful ancient piyut Uv'chen ten pachtecha does fit the nusach of Birkat Kedushat Hashem. It's an elaboration and an expansion of the basic theme of Ha'el HaKadosh, expressed with many more words and with more detail. Just as the Tosefet that Rambam was asked about in Birkat Avodah is entirely within the theme of that, relates to the theme of that baracha with extra words and more specific ideas. But referring to being Nichtav B'Sefer HaHayim does not really have any connection, seems to me, not at all, with Birkat Mochen Avraham, or Mechayim Yefim, or for that matter, Birkat Oseh Shalom, or Mevarech Dam Yisrael B'Shalom. So I don't think these are really comparable. And you could ask yourself, and I do ask myself, about this apparent, quite obvious contradiction between what Rambam says here in Perek Sheni and what Rambam said in Perek Rishon. The end of Perek Rishon we saw, Rambam said Mefurash, Shalosh Rishonot v'Shalosh Aharonot le'olam en nosifim b'hem. And I do not think there is a good answer, and not a truly satisfactory answer. I think that there is a difficulty here. I think Rambam is, I'm not sure Rambam was very happy with this widespread minhag, but which apparently was not universal in his day, because he does say yesh mekomot shenaru b'aseret hayamim, so apparently was not universal. I'm not sure that Rambam was at all really very pleased with it, but he saw this was a very common practice, and he didn't think it was so terrible as to require him to to demand that it be stopped. But the fact is, I don't think it does. It can be reconciled with what Rambam said at the end of Perek Rishon. As I've mentioned, these Tosafot were not known in Eretz Israel, and they also don't fit. You see that the Nusach, for instance, as I said, Zochanu Hayim in Machon Avraham is clearly taking its cue from the term Zocher Hasdei Avot, and then Zochanu Hayim. But if you have those words Zocher Hasdei Avot, which do not appear in the Nusach of the Bracha Rishonah, Nusach Eretz Yisrael, then it doesn't connect at all, right? Just as in the second Bracha of the Shmoneh Esrei, Nusach Bavel, we say, at the end of the second Bracha, B'Hayametim, we say, Micha Mocha, Ba'al Gevuroth, U'Midom Melach, Melech Mitum Hayav Masmech Yeshua, and then it follows naturally. In other words, the Lashon allows you to say immediately, Micha Mocha Avarahamim, because you just said, Micha Mocha Ba'al Gevuroth. But if you don't have those words in Nusach Eretz Yisrael, which you do not, then it's clear that this Nusach, these Tosafot were composed and became commonplace in Bavel, where that was the Nusach. In Eretz Yisrael, it would not have lent itself to becoming a common practice. Yes, you had a question.
Two things. First of all, is it possible if the Rambam could have changed his mind by the time he wrote that Teshuvah?
I don't think you can learn anything of the sort from that Teshuvah, because as I say, the Rambam was asked a question which does not really connect to, it doesn't pertain to this matter that we're discussing. Rambam there was asked about a certain harhavat halashon within Birkat Avodah, which has to do with Inyanei Avodah. So it's not bakashat sarachim, it's not shoeret sarachao in the wrong place. It has nothing to do with this halacha, and therefore Rambam said exactly that. It's not extraneous to the bracha. It fits the bracha, so it's okay. It's not a problem. And therefore I would have no problem with anyone who wishes to say that. I'm not suggesting I would have such a problem at all. But it's not the same. I don't think you can say the same for these Tosafot with which we are familiar, and which obviously grew up in Bavel, and obviously in at some point in the period of the Geonim, that is the historical development. It clearly began in Bavel, and as Nusach Bavel was the common Nusach throughout the world, so these Tosafot eventually became commonplace. But the truth is, I think they do contravene this halacha about adding or changing in any way the last three barachot.
Thanks. And for the second question, the stuff that the Rambam says in Perek Shishi are based off of the Rabbi Akiva's Hanhagoth, where it says that you would find him in one end of the room and then in the other end of the room. Yes. Is that discussing during the Shmoneh Esrei or after the Shmoneh Esrei? The bowing itself.
Well, that's also a good question. It's not explicit. It's not mefurash. You could understand it to mean as part of the Shmoneh Esrei, and he became completely transported and very, very intensely involved in this tefillah, as that's why I mentioned the word Breslev or something like that. Not in a derogatory sense, but to convey the idea of a person being really completely losing themselves in tefillah, which is actually a very high madraga. It could also be that it was part of the tahanunim and hishtahawaya after the Shmoneh Esrei. It could be. Not mefurash, not clear.
So from there, it's not sufficient to learn out how one should be bowing during the Shmoneh Esrei. As in, if he was just bending like people do nowadays, he wouldn't move across the room. That would only make sense if he was doing, hishtahawaya or something.
You're right, but even hishtahawaya Lichora, you're not, you don't begin in one corner and end up in the other corner of the room, as is mentioned there. Lichora. So it's describing a very ecstatic state of Avodat Hashem, which is, as we see, not something to be belittled, not by any means, quite the opposite, not something to be looked at askance, something that you see the greatest Chachamim engaged in. So, something to learn from. But it's also clearly not midat kol adam, because it's mentioned specifically with regards to a certain Chacham who was perhaps known for this more than maybe other Chachamim. It's hard to know exactly, but one assumes he wasn't the only Chacham or the only person who engaged in such an intense form of tefillah. At any rate, the Sofo Shel Davar, Rahamana Liba Ba'eh, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is interested in Kavanat Halev. And that is our focus, should be our focus when it comes to tefillah. All right, Beseder, that we'll end there for today. Neyu Beruchim, Hizku, V'yames Lebavchem, Kol HaMe'ahalim L'Adonai. Shalom v'nisachon.